associate professor of African history at Stanford. And I read about American sexuality and colonialism and a type of colonial violence, which is the negation of multiracial children in the French Empire. And it is such a pleasure to have this group of just very accomplished scholars today talking about this really critical issue of violence in imperial context. And the purpose of our roundtable is to have a really generative conversation, not only amongst ourselves, but with you, the audience. So we just have a format for today where each of them will begin with a little amuse-bouche, if you will, about their research and where they are for about 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to use my dictatorial power as a moderator to ask them then a set of questions, and then we're going to open up to the audience. And we're going to be very disciplined to give people time to engage, and I'm literally going to use the timer so that we have time to do this, because oftentimes it doesn't happen. And I should just say, we all know who all the people are. They're such esteemed scholars. I could go on and on about their accolades, but I won't, just really quickly. And they'll each go in the order presented in the program. So the first person to present on these solutions, Carolyn Campbell, who's professor of history at the University of North Dakota, who published numerous articles in the finest peer-reviewed journals and book chapters on physical, cultural, and political violence, race, and far-right mobilization and fascism of France, Morocco, and Algeria. And currently, I just want to note an emphasis on how people on the ground experience violence and felt its horrors. So the latest book is called The Fascist Colonization of France, Colonial Violence and the Transformation of the French Republic, 1900 to 1945, and that's a book.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming for an early session. I think we're all going to start out talking about how we approach the subject of violence and what interests us about it as scholars. So as Rachel mentioned, I cover the topic of violence and empire as a historian of the far right and fascism. And despite France's huge empire during the era of fascism, the scholarly literature on the relationship between colonialism and fascism is not nearly as developed in France as it is in other cases like Germany and Italy. And so the result is a lack of scholarly understanding on the role that colonialism played in shaping one of the most destructive political movements of the 20th century. And so my work focuses on how historical actors actually experienced different forms of violence that took place during the colonial conquest of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So for example, tens of thousands of white French soldiers fought in wars of colonial conquest. They left the army, and upon coming home to France, they promptly joined political groups. And the vast majority of them joined the radical right. So the question is, how did these soldiers' experiences influence their political action? If you have a colonial officer whose hands are bloody from participating in massacres, razzias, summary executions, and so on, does he simply forget that when he leaves the military? So, obviously not. Moreover, by focusing on how historical actors experienced violence, the perspective of colonized people are critical. So in my own work on the French conquest of Morocco and Chad, oral tradition is revealing and showing how Moroccans and Chadians understood French violence. Oral tradition shows that razzias, shellings, massacres, and summary executions were terrifying. But storytellers also lamented not just the physical violence, but cultural violence as well. So just one example, French military policy emphasized early morning attacks. And in Morocco and Chad, these attacks interrupted Muslim morning prayers. And storytellers depicted those interruptions of their prayers as being as devastating as physical violence. So this physical and cultural violence became central to radical right politics in metropolitan France. And a colonialist movement comprised of former colonial officers developed that became central to fascist politics. In speeches, letters, newspapers, and published works, these colonialists regularly insisted that their experiences with colonial conquest gave them a legitimacy that those lacking knowledge of colonial war did not have. This knowledge supposedly revealed that it was vital to exact violence against one's enemy. the so-called enemy would be anybody contesting the colonialist goals. So in the colonies, the enemy was the anti-colonial resistance fighter. In the metropole, colonialists sought to transfer the hierarchical ethno-religious order of the colonies to places like Paris. So therefore, anybody contesting the transposition of such hierarchies was the enemy. In metropolitan France, that would include feminists, anti-colonial activists, socialists, and communists. So all of these groups drew the ire of these colonialists, of these fascist colonialists, who believed that some sort of violence against them was justified. So to summarize, I'm interested in how people experience violence and the ways in which these experiences get transposed into different contexts. I will say more, but I won't stop there.
So the next person will be Joshua Cole, who's professor of history at the University of Michigan, written extensively about gender and social and cultural history, and a 2019 book called Lethal Provocation: The Constantine Murders and the Politics of French Algeria.
Good morning, everybody. So I came to the study of the French Empire rather late, in the sense that I wrote another book about another subject. But it was in the period of living and researching France in the 1980s and 1990s, which forced me to deal with the history of the French Empire, the legacy of the French Empire for contemporary France. And it was in trying to figure out the answer to those questions for my students when I first began teaching in the 1990s that I turned to the question of empire and the violence question. It was violence that was at the forefront because of the great contemporary debates about torture in the French army during the Algerian War, the commemoration of events like the demonstration of Algerian laborers in 17th October 1961. And I started working on those issues. It was really about the commemoration of violence. I wrote a series of articles about that, really for my students. I think that's what I was trying to do, things I needed to explain to myself. And I came up with a formulation in that context, which I was very proud of at the time, and I'm sort of dubious about now. But it was that it was important not to just study the history of violence for what it did, for what it accomplished, but to study the history of violence in the colonial situation for what it meant. This was something that was important to me at the time, to sort of cast it in that way, because it allowed me to explore moments of violence that had resurfaced, right, like 7th October or the torture days. To study those events as a kind of dialogue, right, that violent acts meant something both to the perpetrators and to the victims, and that those meanings had a history, and that they were then recuperated later into contemporary politics if we wanted to understand the debates that were happening in France. The reason I'm dubious about that, and I think it was fruitful for me to think about it in those terms, it allowed me to bring a kind of ethnographic lens to moments of violence, and it seemed important as a cultural historian to establish that framework. But it was actually a false dichotomy, because of course meaning and doing are related to one another, and the performative aspects of violence are part of what violence does, and I actually think that realizing the inadequacy of that formulation was what took me to a different kind of analysis when I turned to the subject of my book, which was a history of a riot in eastern Algeria in 1934, in which the Muslim residents of the city of Constantine attacked the stores and businesses and residences of Jewish residents of the city. And I had been, I think at this point, strongly influenced by Ben Brower's book, his first book, which showed that even words like colonial violence are a little bit too blunt to talk about what we're after here. The problem with the word colonial violence is it's kind of simple. The colonial part is the adjective and the violence is the thing. And it's as if there's only one kind of colonial violence. I prefer the expression violence in the colonial situation. What I learned from Ben is that the presence of the French in North Africa didn't make all politics just about colonizer versus colonized, but that there were important dimensions of political life and political conflict between Algerians that continued, between people of North African origins, that continued during the colonial period. So violence in the colonial situation seemed like a better way to sort of get at this complexity. And when I turned to the subject of the riot in 1934, what I was after was a way to tell the story of intercommunitarian violence, right? These communities were largely defined in religious terms, in ways where the conclusion was not established beforehand, right? There was a kind of general assumption, this is true in many stories of this kind of violence, that violence results from a hardening of ethno-religious identities. And that seemed very simplistic to me. And in fact, what I discovered is that the violence emerges in a kind of contingent and almost stochastic way, not from a hardening of essential identities, but from the opposite, from experiments in crossing the boundaries that created opportunities for a kind of entrepreneurial use of provocation and violence by certain political actors. And then, so the story of the riot that I took was really about finding finding a story about the ways in which these communities of people who had lived amongst one another, they were neighbors, they knew each other, they were very well acquainted with one another, nevertheless found themselves brought to a moment of explosive and bitter violence. And in this story then, it's true that the senses of identity hardened, but that was best understood as the result of this kind of stochastic process that produced the violence rather than its cause and its origins. And I'll stop there, I have lots more to say about questions.
So because the conversation is already so rich, I'm just going to introduce the last three in quick succession and then go to you. Okay. So Jake and Daughton, I can go on about your many accomplishments, but I'll just really emphasize the most recent book published in 2021 called In the Forest of No Joy, the Congo-Océan Railroad and the Tragedy of French Colonialism. And then we'll go to Bonnie Effros, who's local here. Thank you for this really beautiful setting. I really enjoyed. Who has written very extensively about the early medieval period, and most recently is focusing on colonial archaeology in North Africa and removal of objects, a debate that is very trenchant right now. And then lastly, but not least, Carolyn Eichner, former president of this association, who's also focusing on a new project on personal names and how a more traditional kind of violence, displacement, destruction, and the state imposition of names. And so the topic of cultural violence. So, Bonnie first. That's right, JP first.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Thanks, Rochelle, for kind of corralling us. And thanks to our panelists. It's a great honor to be here with everybody. And thanks to all you for coming out on a beautiful Saturday morning at 8:30 to talk about colonial violence, which is no easy feat. So one of the challenges, I think, of being on a panel like this is that whatever you plan to say, someone else is going to say it before you. So a lot of what Josh just said is certainly resonates with my own experience. I guess I came to think about colonial violence or violence in the colonial setting when I started my dissertation, which this morning I realized, unfortunately, was 25 years ago. I don't know how that happened. But I started thinking about colonial violence because I think you really can't talk about empire without talking about violence. And I think one of the great things about this panel and the people on it is that it really shows the varieties of violence and the ways in which we can think about violence far beyond physical violence to violence of language, the violence of history, the violence of memory. And these are all things that kind of interested me early on. More recently, I started to become fascinated with the relationship between the civilizing mission and a kind of
ostensibly humanitarian development mentality in late 19th and early 20th century empire that I increasingly came to be to understand as being really paradoxically but inextricably linked to violence. And this kind of relationship between civilization and violence was something that kind of fascinated me. And I started to write a book that was going to cover the entire empire, and I thought about reading other empires, and I realized that was going to be like 1,500 pages, and I did not have the emotional wherewithal for that. So I ended up writing this book that came out a couple years ago, or last year, on one of the case studies that I thought was most compelling, which was the construction of the Congo-Salon Railroad, which stretches from Brazzaville to Pointe Noire in equatorial Africa. And it was striking to me, I think, for a number of reasons. The first being that even though I've been teaching colonial history and working on colonial history for, I don't know, a dozen years probably at that point, I'd never really heard that much about the Congo-Salon other than sort of throwaway lines about its violence and its, lots of deaths and so forth. And the more I started to investigate, I realized that it actually is probably the second deadliest construction project in history. And beyond the sort of destructiveness in terms of human lives, I was really struck by how extraordinarily brutal it was, and also how the French administration was both totally open about the brutality. That is to say, they produced huge amounts of reports about it, but also at the same time careful to craft a narrative to justify and essentially to bury the brutality of building it. So in a lot of ways, my book ends up being on the French side very much about the kind of bureaucratic mentality that allowed violence to occur. But while writing it, I also became really fascinated with how to talk about the experience of violence, and particularly the experience of violence of laborers, forced laborers, although they were considered volunteers, always called volunteers throughout the project. Because I found that in the kind of colonial turn of the late 90s and early 2000s, there's a tremendous amount of historiography, a tremendous amount of scholarship produced on the kind of culture of colonialism. And I was really struck, as I started to think more directly about the experience of violence, at the ways in which we as a field, I think, kind of push the details of violence to the side. I'm struck by how many books oftentimes will say things like, such and such happened and there was a lot of violence and a bunch of people died, and sort of move on from there, as opposed to really trying to reconstruct the experience of it. And I thought it was important to try to talk about the details of brutality, of cruelty, of the hardship that was created in some of these construction sites, for example, or in other contexts. Because increasingly in the media, we read about people who dismiss the notion of empire as being destructive. There still is in 2022, I think, we all know, a very prevalent idea that colonialism was a good thing generally and had a few, maybe bad seeds along the way. And it seems incumbent upon me anyway to write something that tried to be very honest and very explicit about what we talk about when we talk about violence in the empire. So I guess I'll start.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here today. I think I probably have the distinction of being the only person in the room who was trained as an early medievalist and then started working on the modern period. And just to preface that in saying that, reading about violence in works of Gregory of Tours is very different than reading the military campaign diaries of officers in the 19th and 20th centuries during the invasion of what's now Algeria. So I originally began my book project looking at the French presence in Algeria from 1830 to 1870, thinking I just finished a project looking at antiquarianism in France, And I noticed there were archaeological societies in North Africa, and I thought this was going to be a way that I was ultimately going to write a book about the Vandal conquest of North Africa, not so much about the 19th century. But one of the things I noticed in doing that was that the membership of the antiquarian societies I was looking at were very different than in France, because they were almost exclusively French officers, military officers. And so I began to think about what this meant for the kind of research I was going to be doing. And I have to say, when you read their archaeological publications, you don't see the violence. They talk about their finds, they talk about the things they've collected, they talk about the greatness of the Roman period, and very little has to do with what they're actually seeing besides these monuments. They've erased the indigenous population. They talk only about themselves. It's as if they could have been in France in a way. So, except that they're officers. And so, I mean, my work has been looking at the way that archaeology gets used for ideological purposes. But in this case, it was really necessary then to recreate the context that was erased in these publications. That wasn't a part of it. Going into the military archives for the first time, I had no idea what it was that I was going to see. And seeing the people whose publications I had read on archaeology, and then seeing what they were doing interspersed with those events was shocking, right? These were in some cases the men who had led razzias that had no compunction about chopping down all of the olive trees, or confiscating the flocks of people, for calling villagers in and demanding that they produce the children who had supposedly violated archaeological sites, basically with graffiti or taking away stones. And that's when the reality of what I was seeing really hit home. And it was very difficult to sort of immerse myself in these documents because of the immediacy of the violence, which had been so artfully concealed from their scholarly production. So I thought in the end, what I was doing was really to bring the violence back into our understanding of archaeology, which we tend to think of as scientific or fact gathering. The traditional histories of archaeology are focused on these narratives of discovery, but they never talk about, or until very recently, about the appropriation and violence that accompanied those events. So I really think that my work has turned to the way in which violence underlay the creation of the disciplines that we're active in today, even if we don't see it immediately. This is also true of our museum collections, which are often scrubbed of these kinds of details when things have been appropriated in a violent way. And just because something is beautiful doesn't mean that there's not a violent history behind it. And we're sitting right now on, the unceded ancestral territory of the Klugen, and we don't see it when we walk around the city, or only in very sort of circumscribed ways. So I guess the way that this violence has had an impact on my work going forward is that it's affected the way that I teach. It's affected the kinds of courses that I want to teach. So I turn to courses that are on history of archaeology and museums to get students to think about what stories aren't contained on museum labels, and what's problematic about discovery narratives, and how might it look different in the future, so that we can understand power structures that underlie our cultural institutions, our academic disciplines, because these are very frequently masked. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. It's unusual for me to be the last of an alphabetical list. Like Josh, I came to colonial history after doing a project on metropolitan France. I'm also losing my voice, sorry. On women and gender in the Paris Commune, which is a clearly violent context in which I focused on the gender aspect. I didn't focus a lot on violence per se, but this is clearly where a place that intellectual, historical research place in which I had been so fully immersed before moving to doing colonial history. And in my most recent book on feminism's empire, on feminism and imperialism in late 19th century France, the context of colonial violence is New Caledonia, most specifically. I mean, it's pervasive in a number of ways, but I'll talk about New Caledonia, which France took possession of in the middle of the 19th century and then used as a penal colony when Guyana was just too deadly for the prisoners and the prison guards. So the violence in New Caledonia is the kind of violence I think that is the most, traditional kind of physical violence. The indigenous Kanak are black, and so the French categorization of Polynesia and Melanesia, this completely fabricated division based on skin color, with the Kanak being black, and thus the French falling amongst what they considered their lowest group of colonized peoples amongst, including sub-Saharan Africans. And so the French denied that they had any culture. They did not recognize that they had agricultural practices because they didn't recognize them. So the French brought in livestock, which had not been in New Caledonia, and destroyed their agriculture. They ultimately forced them onto reservations. They didn't recognize that they had ideas of property. So you have the physical violence and cultural violence, and then also sexual violence. And this is something that has not been written that much about. It's what, and I mean, like Jim was saying, women were abducted. Women were taken. And that I can actually reflect back on the commune also, the Paris Commune, the fact that there was a lot of sexualized violence that has only very recently been written about, and I write about it a little bit in my new brief history, but again, it's the illusions, as opposed to saying that, so here in this context, they raped these women on a systematic basis. It tends to sort of just be glossed over. And so in the New Caledonian context, their appropriation of land, forced reservations, deportation is punishment. The Kanak rose up against the French multiple times, most notably and most significantly in 1878, after which the French just came down incredibly hard and deported men to other islands, and just it was a brutal kind of repression. So it's sort of a range of kinds of violences. And then the work that I'm doing now, which is on names, which is on personal names, is a cultural violence. So in France, in the end of the 19th century, the French authorities mandated that Algerian Muslims take permanent last names. They had done this for metropolitan Jews under Napoleon at the beginning of the century. And as Deirdre Lyons talks about, so incredibly interesting, she's here somewhere, that the recently emancipated enslaved people in Guadeloupe and Martinique were assigned names as a way to shape a kind of patriarchal culture. So it's a very gendered kind of policy. And in Algeria, the idea of traditional naming being insufficient to the French to be able to count, tax, monitor, it led the French to do this. With Jews in metropolitan France, they had to pick names that were French. They couldn't pick names reflective of their culture because of the idea they could sort of be assimilated and ultimately disappear. But for Algerian Muslims, they had to take names that were reflective of being Algerian or Muslim. And they had 2 months to do it, and the head of the family had to do it, and this was ahead of the French defined what family was, and if the head of the family didn't do it in the 2 months, they were assigned names, and the names were often profoundly insulting. Dog's head, things, they were just really offensive names, and so it's an attempt at cultural erasure, it's an attempt to mark people, and so just another way of thinking about this kind of violence. And also, you know, for me, it's very much connected to the significance of naming and names as a site of power. So, in my work, violence has sort of, you know, consistently been there, and it's not. I haven't written a thing on violence, but I think that this panel, I think it's kind of a really great way to rethink, you know, what I've done, where I've been, and to think about that moving forward.
So I'm going to be a little mud out now, because I've been circulating questions, but what you've already said has just generated new questions. So I'm going to start with something that African Studies Association actually did. They started a series of articles on keywords, agency, slavery, for example. So I'm going to start with the keyword of violence. You've each already mentioned that part of your work is unearthing what is hidden in plain sight to people, and actually naming it so that you can tell the histories. And you've also talked about how there are different kinds of violence. Sexual violence, physical violence, cultural violence, political violence. So just the first question is, how do you define violence? And I'll start with the most basic way. I just went to the Webster's Online Dictionary. Define violence as behavior involving physical force or intimidation intended to damage, intimidate, hurt, or kill someone. So you all have been using this term. Again, in each of your work, how are you defining this term? And why is it different? Is it important to parse out different types of violences, if you will?
Who wants to start with that one?
I think, well, clearly, the dictionary definition only talks about the physical. I mean, it's just the most obvious sort of sense that it's a really narrow and it's incredibly partial kind of definition. And as we've all seen, I mean, violence is something. I think if I had to, do you want to define it? Okay. Ish. I would say violence is intentional or unintentional aggression against people, groups, or things, which results in something. This is incredibly broad, but it's something negative. I mean, it's certainly broad, but I mean, I'm trying to think, where do I cut it off? And so maybe, you know, I'll just stop with that. Maybe somebody can do better. But it's you know, it's so much. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It can be, it manifests. Violence happens in so many contexts, in so many ways, and I think that, you know, the fact that it is so hidden makes it really, when you try to narrow it down and define it like this, you start with something like this.
So, I'm going to not give a definition, but I think the difficulty of giving the definition is what is interesting here. The reason that we resort to physical acts of violence when we strive for a definition, is because that's where the power is. And that's what we're after when we're talking about violence. We want to talk about extreme applications of power. And physical acts of violence hurt. And pain is something that is a kind of immediately recognizable thing, but also a place of great mystery and difficulty in communicating. Elaine Scarry wrote quite beautifully and movingly and somewhat controversially that you know, we can never know somebody else's pain. Pain is something that's very hard to communicate. It's one of the things that makes trauma so hard for victims, that they can't communicate the scope or the extent or the meaning of the pain that they feel, and that nobody can understand it. And that in certain kinds of physical violence, like the archetypal one is torture itself, right? It's the enormity of that gap. This is what I wrote in my article about violence, that the enormity of that gap between what the perpetrator knows and what the victim knows at that moment, which is a kind of intimacy also, right? It's two people confronting the physicality of their bodies, stripped away of the veneer of the niceness of civilized behavior, right? And so it's the immediacy of that power relationship that gives the physical part its necessity, but it's also which makes violence a very powerful metaphor. So when we talk about, some people use expressions now like slow violence, or even the language of microaggression, right, is a way of trying to retain the immediacy of the physical and all of the mystery and complexity of that relationship, but for other kinds of social interactions that don't involve a slap or a punch or a stab or an electric shock, right? So violence is both something we want to have. We want to talk about its immediacy, and we also want its power as a metaphor, so that we can think about the ways that redlining neighborhoods is a kind of violence against the population, right? But that's metaphoric. It's different. We're not talking about the same thing. So we want a definition of violence that has both immediacy and metaphoric value. That's why it's hard to define.
I guess one thing that I'd say is, at least in my work, was the tension that existed. I initially was looking at the violence against objects, and then had to deal with the problem of violence against people, and also to keep those things in balance, right? Like, because the destruction of objects should not be more important than the violence that was done against the people in order to acquire those artifacts or to study them. So that was one tension that I found in my work, was how to tell that story of violence in a way that was just and humane, because there's a lot of undocumented prices that people paid for the interest in archaeology. The other thing that really struck me in terms of the kind of violence that I was seeing, is the kind of violence that happens in a war zone, in which there's no distinction between civilians and people who are engaged in the war. Looking at events like the 1845 asphyxiation of an entire community of people who had fled into a cave, and they all died as the French military officers lit a fire in front of the cave and the smoke blew in. So it was also a kind of violence that is so pervasive that there is no escape from it in essence. And so I guess this idea of total war or absolute violence, in which you can't claim civilian status, you can't claim anything because you're always portrayed as the enemy. I don't have a real definition for it, but it was something that was clearly on my mind as I attempted to write about this form of colonial violence that I encountered in the archives.
As I mentioned earlier, coming to this as a historian of fascism, and as some of you may know, in the historiography of fascism, there's a real debate of, can you even define fascism? And some people will say yes, and some people will say no. But one thing that's really interesting that comes from this debate is the idea that, especially some historians who are a little bit reticent to offer a definition, is they say that the job of the historian is to explore what people living at the time believed fascism was. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking now, is that a definition of violence can be difficult, and maybe a useful approach would be to look at how people living at the time define violence. And so I kind of mentioned earlier, like if you look at the conquest of Morocco in the 1910s, Amazigh communities, the storytellers, a lot of the poems, for lack of a better word, they talk about how French violence was fire. And so when I think about violence in Moroccan conquest, I think of fire. But if I read the French officers' depictions of violence, it's, you know, it's pretty banal. So that's something that's useful for me, is to try to, it's kind of a cop-out to your question. Because it's a little bit, if you don't offer a definition, as you were saying, Josh, that definitions can be power. But also, again, with the historiography of fascism, there's been really useful lines of inquiry to really delve into different groups of people and say, what do they think fascism wants?
Yeah, just to add to the chorus of people who can't define violence. I mean, I think that the metaphor of violence is very useful and very powerful, I think, for historians, because it is so shape-shifting, right? We can talk about violence against artifacts, we can talk about violence against human beings, we can talk about violence against culture. But I do think it ends up seeming somewhat meaningless at the end of the day. And I mean, in my own work, thinking about just the varieties of violence in Equatorial Africa, ended up moving away ultimately from violence, in large part because, you know, I went to the archives when I first started looking, and, you know, did keyword searches and this sort of thing for violence, right? Thinking it would pop up, but obviously it is invisible oftentimes, so there's not much discussion of violence. But even if you do keyword searches of texts about essentially colonial violence, usually it's words like brutality, cruelty, inhumanity that are being used, usually in a physical sense. And I guess, you know, so I started to think much more about terms like that, like cruelty and inhumanity, because it seemed to be more in the sort of spirit of the people at the time, and because violence as a kind of analytical category is kind of lacking in fundamental ways. I mean, it's powerful, I think, as a metaphor, but you know, just the fact that you can talk about violence in vastly different contexts, I think, is an indication of the kind of meaninglessness of it on a certain analytical level. One thing I'll say about power, I mean, it's interesting to think about violence as power. My own work, thinking about why it is that a French colonial effort to build a railroad ended up becoming so violent, one of the main answers I came to was actually a lack of power. I mean, I was much more kind of influenced, I guess, by Hannah Arendt with the sort of notion that violence is the byproduct of a lack of power. And for me, colonial violence, you know, if we're going to offer broad explanations, has to really start with the weakness of colonialism, the weakness of imperial rule, rather than sort of strength. And you know, that is probably obvious to many of us, but I think it's maybe somewhat counterintuitive. But.
So can I just ask a second question, and we'll open up to the audience, because I'm sure there's many questions and discussions. So it's about the ethics of writing about violence. So all writers have mentioned the words just or justice, trauma, pain, humanity, and also the cost of violence. And I think in particular, there's a director named Abigail Disney who put together a documentary called Create the Devil, Back to Hell, about violence in Sierra Leone, who talked about the misery porn, if you will, of also in writing or in making movies or whatever about violence, that you're also putting people's pain and trauma and suffering in a way that does not bring any solace to them. So what are the ethics of writing about violence that serves as your compass to how you write about this, what you're trying to demonstrate? And is there a role to these things, again, about justice, humanity, in your work? Or is there no place for that in historical scholarship? As we think about all of the debates that are abounding right now in this moment of polarization about the place of history. Sorry.
Yeah, so obviously, in writing about the riot, which was, in the one hand, in the great scheme of things, 28 people died. It was in the 1930s, right? It was a decade where a lot of bad things happened on the way to something much more cataclysmic. And I don't want to say it was a banal event, but for the people and the families who lived through that day in Algeria, it was the worst day of their lives. They lost family members who were murdered in very brutal ways. So of course, there's a responsibility about how you narrate it. But you can't sugarcoat things either. Particularly if, in my case, it was actually important for me to describe the ways in which people died, because the form that violence takes is part of, coming to grips with that is part of what it means to account for it. And it's the accounting of violence. And I'm borrowing this language actually from John Scott's recent book on the judgment of history, where she suggests that, I think in quite powerful and disturbing ways, that it's very hard to claim that there is in fact an overarching story of humanity that bends towards justice. That our master narratives of progress have been, revealed to be part of the tools of violent civilizational conquests and colonial expansion and rest. So that we can't naively hope for a kind of historical position of a kind of moral rectitude in which we can situate all these terrible things in a story that leads towards a kind of account that leads inexorably towards justice that might be beyond our reach. But it is nevertheless important in each case to provide an accounting, to try and understand, above all, how these events unfold in the particularities of their context at the time. Recognizing even the contingency involved in producing these horrific events. It sounds like you're writing history from a position of weakness, and in some sense we always are, right? Our evidence is always fragmentary. We try and attribute responsibility in the ways that we can, but it's a struggle. But it's the accounting that makes it necessary. And beyond that, the narration is just, the rules are pretty simple. Don't sensationalize. I actually, get rid of adjectives and adverbs. Describe the actions, set them in context, try and figure out what they meant for the people at the time.
I guess for me to try to avoid misery porn, which is a very powerful phrase, but I think it's important to try to humanize the victims if you can. And humanizing them would be getting access to sources that depict their point of view, and that is often difficult to find. But that's why I was talking about oral tradition in a couple of cases that I study. And then I also, for me, again, as a historian of fascism, I'm very influenced by work on the question of depicting violence from the Holocaust, comparative genocides. And as several people have already said, they talk about how important it is to depict the brutality. And so to try to kind of balance that of depicting brutality with trying to capture the humanity of the people experiencing the violence is important. And I guess one thing I would add is hopefully as a historian you don't become desensitized to what you're studying. I mean, you know, hopefully it hits you. And I think if you become desensitized, maybe that's kind of a problem.
I tend to be interested in looking at individuals and trying to understand the context through individual lives, and something that I have always felt is the importance of trying to that I have a responsibility to best represent them in a way that they might recognize and positively. And so what was their experience, and what are their ideas, and their feelings, only to the extent I think if they had ever to that. But for the New Caledonia context, the Kanaka oral culture in this period, and the violence done to them is thus, almost exclusively, but as the period goes on, not exclusively, represented by the doers of the violence, the French, or the kind of rare French person who is sympathetic. And so it's really hard to, in this kind of context, to be able to have the perspective of the victims or survivors. So I think it's something that I kind of consistently try to get at, but I don't think that, given my access to information, can fully succeed really for this kind of context. So I do sort of as best as I can, and then say according to this person, but we just don't know how. I mean, clearly we know how the Kanaka experience dispossession, rape. I mean, we have an idea of what that means, but to try and get this, the ethical responsibility to best understand the context and represent how the people experienced it is, for me, it's just a kind of an insurmountable thing, ultimately in that kind of context. And with for Algeria and the naming, Algerians wrote about it, and so there I have the access to the anger, frustration, sadness that this kind of cultural violence created, and so that in a way that it allows me to be a little bit more confident in writing something that I feel is is representative as it can be for me, without also but important language. I don't read Arabic, so I started out as a historian of France. I do these multiple contexts, and I don't read Arabic, so I'm not getting their words in their language.
So I would say actually the ethics of writing about this is what weighed on me most heavily in writing the book that I wrote. I would even say that having written it, I'm left with a great ambivalence about it. And I think that really anybody who writes about violence in a lot of ways is left with a certain ambivalence. Because, I tried using all the methods that my fellow panelists described to avoid sensational language, to describe, to describe things in, very cold terminology in ways as best I can. I sweated over photographs, whether or not to use photographs, which photographs to use. There were photographs I did not use for reasons that I felt like they could be interpreted as kind of, misery porn. So it was hard, and I think in the end, as has been said, I mean, I felt like, trained as a Europeanist, I mean, particularly 20th century Europe, when we talk about violence, we usually talk about people who
who bear witness, right? I mean, this is key for the First World War. Much written around about it. There is a huge amount on the Holocaust about the importance of bearing witness. And it struck me that one of the case, one of the aspects of the Congo Salon, because it was equatorial Africa, because they're not written documents produced by the laborers themselves, although you can get their voices through French archival documents and through photographs. I mean, I used quite a few photographs for that purpose. You know, there is no testimony really that exists, and it does seem incumbent upon historians of empire, if we're going to write about it honestly and seriously, to try to recreate something that looks like bearing witness to what happened. I think that ties into this public idea that empire wasn't that bad, right? I think that it helps us as a society today to understand the history better. But you're always left with concerns, and I think you're not going to please everybody. I think is the other issue. But I do think that there needs to be an effort to do it. It's just, for me, I kept reminding myself to just remain humble. I think the humility of the historian really has to come through, and the respect for the people that you're writing about.
Oh, sorry.
So in thinking about the way that objects entered into my story, part of the French campaign was to appropriate objects in Algeria and say that they were theirs and they didn't belong to Algerians, and that they had no connection to the Arab or Berber past. And so I think the way in which French culture was embodied in the objects and the way in which the French treated them made these objects then symbolic of French rule. And because of the violence that was perpetrated in the process of doing this and the success of this narrative, the problem now for modern Algerians is what to do with these artifacts and monuments that still exist in Algeria, and the difficulty then in, preserving them, in integrating them into an understanding of Algerian identity and what role they play, because especially there, unlike in Tunisia, I think where the case was made for identifying, say, with Punic remains, the problem in Algeria with the Roman material that's been discovered is that for the past, almost 200 years, it's been exclusively associated with the Latin West and the violence of the Latin West. And I mean, this is perhaps an extreme example, but you think about the actions taken by ISIS against Palmyra, right? That the destruction of objects associated with Western imperialism, not just from antiquity, but also from the modern period, means that these objects then become sort of a token in these larger fights about cultural heritage and who gets the right to designate what it is. And so I guess in terms of the way that I deal with violence is I can't, as historians, we can't fix what happened in the past. We try to document it. And because those objects are still there, I feel like the place where, I have an obligation to make a contribution is to discuss then what that means, what those objects mean, and to allow Algerians to decide. I recently spoke on a remote panel that was held in Algeria about cultural antiquities with a group of youth ambassadors and the Ministry of Tourism in Tlemcen about what should they do with these remains now, right? Like, are they part of Algeria's heritage? Should they be used to attract tourists to Algeria? Should they be preserved? Or are they just one more sign of a violent legacy in the region? And so I guess what I feel that I'm empowered to do is to tell a bit of the story about how this transpired, and then to having provided material that's in archives in France and not in Algeria, helping to reconstruct a story that people in Algeria may not be able to tell because they can't get to Paris or they can't get to Aix-en-Provence to see this material. I guess this is where I feel like, at least maybe something that I'm doing is not just for scholarly purposes, but that it can have practical application in helping to deal with this legacy of violence and help these communities then move on and sort of, I guess, to decide what the meaning is going to be for them, and not allow the French narrative to color entirely their understanding of this historical legacy.
So let's just have some, I think, so that this is being recorded, so let's just have 3 questions, and then we'll go on from there. There are 4 hands, all 4 of you, go ahead and pass around the mic so that the recording can pick it up. And then pass it back here.
Thank you for organizing this session. And with all due respect, but to be totally frank, I found this really frustrating because it seems like you guys are really dancing around some of the key issues. I mean, colonialism and violence are inseparable. This is an exceptional state of affairs where a territory is conquered oftentimes within recent memory, within a generation, conquered by violence, maintained by violence, either military violence or quotidian violence, beating a worker on a construction site or a petty cab driver. The operation of political economy is only made possible by violence. JP showed this with the railway. It's also a time period of incredible social, economic, revolutionary social economic changes, all pushed through by violence. So violence is saturating the whole thing, and it all really falls apart when the French state can't exercise and deploy violence far enough away to keep the whole system running. We could French state after World War II. And then the other key factor that I found missing was a frank discussion of race. And as the moderator pointed out yesterday, race is a very slippery category that has different historical meanings. But the violence in the empire was understood by all parties as being racially coded in various ways. Most specifically, there are certain things in the colonial setting that could be done to white bodies that could not be done to brown or black bodies. And the kind of violence that could be done in the colonies did not exist in Europe until the Nazis, right? That's sort of that throwback famous Césaire argument. And there's this racial arithmetic of violence against one settler in Algeria, one white settler, could result in the death of 100 or 1,000 Algerians in return. And I think that unequal racial arithmetic is really central to the whole thing. And I strongly urge you to look at the work of my friend Kim Wagner, who's written on violence in the colonial Raj in 1857. Amritsar, he's got an amazing book called The Skull of Alan Beg, about the skull of a rebel that actually came into his possession, and his reflections upon dealing with that history of violence. So, again, with all due respect, my head is kind of exploding there. And I'm someone who's been writing on violence for 25 years.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone. My question is about teaching. I, in the past, have had the experience of dealing with this issue of the pornography of violence and students being too interested in violence, but I'm actually recently finding the opposite. I taught Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands in a class, and I thought students liked learning about World War II, the Holocaust, and my students could not handle it. I had to give them breaks from the reading. They felt like there was no differentiation between violence against prisoners of war, violence against Jews, famine. It was very overwhelming for them, and I'm just wondering if you have experienced this at all in your teaching, and how are we going to be coping with basically the opposite problem in these upcoming generations of students who maybe are shying away from things that they find extremely troubling and are looking for things that, I know that we are a receptive audience to this kind of scholarship, but I'm not sure if that's going to always be that way.
Thanks, everyone. That was really interesting. And I have a question that's kind of similar to Mike's, but maybe in a different vein. I'm interested in picking up on some of JP's comments. Whether we're talking about the deployment of power or the constitution of power when we talk about violence. And what I didn't hear much about was sort of cultures of violence or systemic violence, right? So if we're saying that violence comes from a place of weakness, at some point it becomes a part of strength. And so I wonder if you could talk about that across very interestingly diverse sort of areas of expertise. Thank you.
And I think Sarah had a question.
Thanks everyone for this panel. I had many thoughts. And also I've had some reactions, not maybe as strongly as Mike, but to some of the things that are being discussed. And so something that I've been thinking about, I wish this book had come out 2 years earlier, but Britt Brown's book on Tappy's Revolt, I realize that we're in an audience of the Francophone world. The second Tappy's Revolt takes place on Jamaica. But he makes this argument that colonialism is essentially militarization, right? And I'm myopic in that sense because of what I study. And so I was kind of curious about the kinds of limitations or possibilities that thinking of colonialism as militarization affords us. How does it allow us to see the banalization of colonial violence, and how does it then kind of communicate to us potentially what is excessive or normative violence in these various spaces? And also, like, something that I work with is studying people who are colonized, who exert lots of violence on the part of the colonial state. And so it becomes very interesting also to think about the individual choices that people make within these systems of colonial violence. And I think that's something that Josh was alluding to, right? Like how to kind of track context and then how people kind of find themselves in these contexts and how they're able to navigate these contexts in a variety of ways. And it's sometimes very difficult from the historical documents to see the kinds of choices that these people are making. And I think we'll just leave it there. Oh, I guess the last thing I will say, I'm sorry, is if we, to circle back to the first point, if we do think of colonialism as kind of French imperial militarization, then where is the battlefield? That we're kind of thinking about.
Okay, so who wants it first?
Thanks for those questions, which were, I think, great. And I feel bad that Mike's head is exploding. I don't. I certainly wouldn't want anybody to walk out of this room saying that the people on the panel are not aware of the importance of race and colonial violence. And if it didn't come up explicitly, it may have been by the way that some of the questions were phrased. I think when we get to the points that I made earlier about defining violence and thinking about a kind of quintessential violent act like an act of torture in the French Algerian War, this is how racial distinctions are made manifest in the world. And it's because at that moment, the world is divided into two kinds of people. People who can torture and people who are torturable. In the colonial situation, that is the fundamental way in which the power of race is defined, right? That is, of course, why Fanon begins with violence in his first chapter. And it's why Fanon demands a violence in return, the counter-violence of the anti-colonial nationalist, in order to achieve a humanity which has been denied by the act of colonization itself. That, I think, it was a hugely important moment for me as a teacher to sort of deal with that argument in my own work. And then to realize that that political analysis in Fanon did not exhaust the possibilities of analysis for the colonial situation. That the politics of colonized versus colonizer, or you can't tell the story of the Algerian Revolution without that. But you can't tell the story of 130 years of French presence in Algeria without also paying attention to the ways that other kinds of subject identities were at play. And here, this is why I, in fact, went to the 1930s to try and figure out. So I was writing in the late when I was turning to the empires, in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I was becoming obsessed with the legacy of the colonial past for contemporary France. And all the debate in the newspapers was about the 50s and the early 60s, right? The violence of the French-Algerian War. But that wasn't for me the place that I wanted to go, because by that point, the sort of, what I saw as the sort of reductive opposition between a racialized colonialism and a redemptive anti-colonial nationalism was the only story that you could discern from the kind of bright glare of that conflict. And what I wanted to understand was, what were the politics of the colonial situation at the last moment in French Algeria before there was a mass-based nationalist movement? When there were Algerian peoples who were asking for the vote, right? When there were Algerian, that is, so it wasn't that race wasn't at play then there too, of course, but it was a moment that was filled with all sorts of other possibilities that were present there, and we didn't really understand it. We didn't have there was a history of the moderate Algerians who were seen as somehow collaborators, but there was something else going on there too about trying to create a different kind of politics on the local level, and that's what I wanted to. And frankly, Fanon's story about the colonial city and the divisions between the settlers and the Algerian peoples, which served his arguments about the redemptive violence of anti-colonial nationalism, it didn't exhaust the potential political life that I needed to describe in the 1930s. I'll just leave it there. And I don't mean to. I think, in fact, I'll stop there. But as a way of responding to some of that.
I guess one thing that I would say is this question of race I don't think is quite clear at the outset of the conquest of Algiers. I'd point to, say, the writings of Hamdan Koja, who was a advisor to the Ottoman court in Algiers, who wrote Le Miroir in the early 1830s, and said, when the French first came, they thought that it might actually be better under French rule because of the Enlightenment, that he had read the works of Rousseau and thought that the arrival of the French might bring something different or better than Ottoman despotism. And I think that the shock, the immediate breaking of many promises that were made at the time of the initial French arrival, the confiscation of mosques and the deterioration almost immediate of the situation from there, made it very clear. I mean, there's a certain ambivalence, I would say, in the 1830s and 1840s, in the midst of this violence, about what French presence would mean. And I think also the French were quite ambivalent about what they understood their role to be in this area, so that this violence that happens, the acquisition of territory, is not. It's some of the. I guess what I'm saying is that the French are kind of ambivalent because they think in a way that coming to North Africa, at least among certain parties, was about restoring the reign of Augustine of Hippo in this region, and that the Berbers were actually part of those Christianized people that Augustine of Hippo had dealt with, centuries before. So I guess I don't have I think by the 1870s it's a very different situation in terms of that racial divide than it is in the 1830s. when there is still an understanding, at least among certain groups, that there might be a possibility of this being something that, I wouldn't say mutually beneficial, but something that potentially could incorporate the population as opposed to what ultimately becomes a process of eliminating the indigenous population or seeking to through violent means, through legal procedure, essentially when they give up on the assimilation of this population. In other words, because in terms of the way that the French think about the Roman conquest, they thought that they would be doing something similar, and it becomes something quite different. So I guess, I don't have these are just sort of thoughts that are occurring to me, but I'm not sure. I mean, I think looking backwards from a later period, and that's why I focused on this early period, because I was interested is when these institutions are not all set in place, how do people, it seems like people acting on the ground had a lot more latitude, like these military officers were making kinds of decisions because they didn't have sort of necessarily direct interference by the Ministry of War in all instances. But it's very ambitious men like Bouguereau who changed the look and the way in which the war proceeds, so that say the early some of the early priests, for instance, that are working in the 1830s, they actually reach out to their Arab contemporaries. Of course, they think that they're inferior because they're not Christian, but at the same time, there is dialogue, and that dialogue then gets erased later on when it's clear from the 1840s and the conquest of the Sahara, and the kind of violence that's being perpetrated. And in the course of that, I guess I don't see it as quite so clear cut as you suggest.
Thanks for all your questions. I'd like to answer all of them, but all of my colleagues are talking about the issue of race, and it is obviously very important. And I mentioned that I studied, white French officers, and it is definitely the case that, whether in the specific people that I studied, they were part of the conquest of Morocco and the conquest of Chad. And it is very clear that they wielded violence as freely as they wanted against black and brown bodies. But they also developed a repertoire of violence. There's different types that they could choose depending upon the situation, different tactics that they could use. And so when I was talking about the transposition of violence throughout the French imperial nation state, when these colonial officers left the military and basically helped build the radical right in France, the repertoire of tactics, the violent tactics that they had, they couldn't wield the physical violence against bodies that they saw as white in metropolitan France, but they still had other tactics, namely intimidation. And I think one of the most famous cases is Colonel Francois Delarue talked about the Quadrille PSF. One of their major approaches to violence was they echoed the Ote to say, we show force so that we don't have to use it. And again, that's a tactic of intimidation. And so whereas in Morocco, intimidation would be used alongside razzias, massacres, because in that case, they're like the specific people I study are the Amazon people of the Middle Atlas. Somebody like Leroux, who was involved in summary executions. He might have liked to have done that to communists, but he couldn't do that because the racial dimensions were very different. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for all your questions. I guess we're going to go around through for each question. For Mike's, I think all of colonialism begins with violence, but then I think it evolves, and then I think you have to ask the question of what is violence, right? Because violence, intimidation, and is it coercion, and what about, I mean, the Hawaii now, right? It's colonized, but is this, is there a particular kind of violence that keeps, Hawaii or Puerto Rico under U.S. control that's different? I mean, it clearly is, it changes so much, but it remains colonized. And I think, the racial element, in my work is that, I said the Kanak, it's just, it is the bottom line, and it is violent, and it is, I think it is also, in my work in New Caledonia, it is the complete, the dehumanization of the Kanak. They are, they're barely human, right, for the French. No culture, no, recognizable, anything. And so, no attempts to introduce education, nothing. And so I think that is the real kind of this racial hierarchy thing, which is really different than if you look at, Algeria, where I'm looking at Algeria specifically in this context with the kind of cultural violence and naming. And that is a completely racialized thing where they want the Algerian Muslims to be marked with their names. And even if they convert to Christianity, they can't give their children Christian first names. Which again, that is a kind of violence. But I think that the define of violence, saying is it our colonialism and violence, is it one and the same? I think that it calls for a little more subtlety.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I would echo what has been said. I think, Dan said, I think we said you can't really do the history of empire without doing the history of violence. Certainly the two are linked in complex and extensive ways. I do think, though, that beyond the kind of metaphor of the colonialism is violence, and we need to methodologically, as historians, get to the nuance. And for me, one of the things I have to keep in mind when talking about a construction site where at least 25,000 people died, where there was incredible brutality, is that there were actually a lot of Frenchmen who were absolutely appalled by what was going on. And it was totally clear that the documents, in documents, that colonial administrators did not want physical violence. They did not welcome it. So going from that, you can say metaphorically, well, they were still being violent, the tactics being used, that's true. But there is that question of how do we as historians explain why a particular moment leads to a worker being beaten to death, and another particular moment leads to groups of workers working, without the use of coercion. There has to be a kind of level of nuance, it seems to me, in that discussion to understand the particulars of violence, beyond the kind of metaphor of it. The militarization question, just to get to some of the other ones, I think is interesting. To that point, Vince Brown's book, I actually have some issues with that argument about militarization. I think that there's almost a way in which he uses militarization to make colonialism seem more relevant to broader discussions about warfare, and to put it within a kind of historiographical discussion around those that I don't think is necessary, and which I think particularly in the case of the French Empire, which prided itself, despite obviously having military, being a civilian republican undertaking. It's important to try to, again, understand at least the distinctions between what were imagined as sort of civilian rule versus militarized rule, or military rule. But that's a more complicated issue. Do I have 1 second? Okay, 1 second. The teaching, I think, is super interesting, and perhaps more valuable to all of us to think about. I have completely experienced that. The pandemic pushed kids over the edge. What was, kind of, let's face it, when, if it bleeds, it leads, kind of, if you have
Nazis in your syllabus, you'll get students to sign up, I think has really switched since. And I find students to be extremely unhappy to be reading about violence. And actually, texts that I never thought were particularly sensationalist, I've had students call, misery porn. And that kind of ends the conversation, I think, in a classroom. So it's really tricky. I mean, I think Bloodlands is way too bloody and way too long. So, but finding ways, and it's not easy to discuss these things with, shorter readings, more bite-sized morsels. I mean, I've taught Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men for 20 years, and just in the last year or two, students have just either not read, not shown up for class, not wanted to discuss it. So, I mean, I think this ties in with a much broader discussion about the kind of mental health of our students and the difficulties of having to navigate that, particularly with institutions lacking resources to deal with it on a personal level, but certainly, how that trickles into the classroom, I think is maybe good for another roundtable.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm half in history and half in women's and gender studies, and I've taught in women's and gender studies. We have a pedagogical tradition of what's now called trigger warning, but I've been teaching since before that phrase was created. But of saying that there's in this reading there's going to be some things that maybe upsetting, sexual violence, racist imagery, etc. So the thing that I think I taught Toni Morrison's Beloved a couple of times before the pandemic, and students needed breaks. Some students asked to not come to class, and I think that it's this kind of it's like it's trauma-informed pedagogy, which my university now is doing to any department that wants it. And so, of course, who's the first one to do it? Women's and Gender Studies, where they come and they're basically teaching us this pedagogy under a different name. But I think that perhaps in classes that might have like beyond World War II or something, whereas in the past maybe students didn't feel comfortable expressing discomfort. That now that there's more of a critical mass of students who are, marked by the pandemic and feel like it's okay to express it. So perhaps that it's even, coming up in ways that it didn't come up before, but might have been there.
We're at time. We want to be respectful of people's time that there's a draft together here. But as I see the conveners of the journal who are here today, perhaps because it's being recorded, it may be interesting to have this recording and the transcript as, I guess, the dissemination of knowledge about this. And certainly, I'm so glad you went to the teaching question, because a part of the purpose of the society is to write a more capacious French history than the question of how do we go beyond talking with ourselves as researchers, and also how does what we create just gets to a broader audience and discussed is certainly an important one. So with that, just thank you to the panelists and to the audience.